Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're kind of switching gears from our usual topics to something that affects, well, pretty much all of us, driving. But not just any driving. We're talking about staying safe on the road when conditions get a little, rough.
Exactly. Yeah, think of this as a kind of driver's ed refresh, but like way more interesting. We're diving into a whole pile of driver's manuals and safety guides, pulling out those nuggets of wisdom that'll help you navigate those dicey weather situations.
Yeah, because let's be honest, who hasn't white-knuckled it through a sudden downpour or like felt that little panic when the car starts to skid on an icy patch?
I think we've all been there at some point. What I find fascinating about these guides is they don't just tell you what to do, they explain the why, which I think is really key to actually understanding how to react in those split-second moments.
Okay, so let's unpack this treasure trove of driving wisdom. What were some of the big takeaways that jumped out at you?
It might sound basic, but both sources were really, really hammering home the importance of preparation.
Hmm. Okay.
And I'm not just talking about having an ice scraper handy, although that's never a bad idea.
Right.
It's about like having that pre-trip mindset, taking those few extra minutes to check your tire pressure, make sure your fluids are topped off, even something as simple as making sure your headlights are clean can make a huge difference when visibility is poor.
It's all about minimizing risk before you even put the car in drives, right?
Exactly.
And sometimes that means making the tough call to not drive at all, huh?
Absolutely. One thing both sources emphasize is like respecting weather warnings. I know it can be tempting to think, oh, it's just a little snow, but those conditions can change so rapidly.
Yeah. And that's when you get caught off guard. Speaking of being caught off guard, one thing that really struck me in these guides was just how much emphasis they put on visibility.
Right.
Like it's everything.
It's like the golden rule of driving, especially in adverse conditions. If you can't see, you can't react.
And they had some really interesting insights into how different weather conditions can actually affect visibility. Like, did you know that black ice is so dangerous partly because it's so hard to see? It just blends right in with the road.
It's so deceptive.
Totally.
And then there's that whole thing about high beams in fog, which seems counterintuitive, but it actually can make the fog look like this blinding wall.
They also mentioned using the right edge of the road as a guide in fog, which I'd never heard before.
Yeah, it's about having that fixed visual reference when that center line kind of disappears.
Interesting.
Speaking of visibility, we can't forget about nighttime driving. One source gave some great advice about something called overdriving your headlights, which basically means you're going too fast for how far your headlights illuminate.
Oh, that sounds like a recipe for disaster,
Yeah.
especially on those dark, winding roads.
Exactly. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking you can see further than you actually can, especially when there's no oncoming traffic.
Right.
So the key takeaway here is to, adjust your speed to what you can actually see, not just to the posted speed limit.
So we're talking about being proactive with car maintenance, being mindful of visibility. But what about the actual act of driving when conditions are less than ideal? What pearls of wisdom do these guides offer up on that front?
Well, this is where those slow and steady wins the race cliches, they kind of become like words to live by, literally.
Right, because our instinct in those situations can be to tense up, overcorrect,
Hmm.
but these guides are all about maintaining control, and that starts with your speed.
Exactly. Both sources really emphasize how sudden movements, whether it's braking, accelerating, even turning too sharply, can lead to skids, especially when the road is wet or icy.
And they explain why that is, which I think is so important. Like one source pointed out that when your tires hydroplane, you're essentially like water skiing. No wonder you lose control.
That's such a vivid way to put it. You're literally gliding on top of the water, which means you've lost that crucial friction between your tires and the road.
So easing up on the gas is key. But what about those times when you do hit a patch of water or ice? Any tips on how to handle a skid?
Yeah, they had some great advice on that. The biggest thing is to stay calm and don't slam on the brakes.
Which is easier said than done, right? When you feel that loss of control.
Right. It's all about counterintuitive driving. So instead of braking, you actually want to steer in the direction you want the car to go.
Interesting.
And then once you feel the tires regain traction, you can gently apply the brakes.
So we're talking about smooth, controlled movements, even in those panic-inducing situations.
Precisely. And these guides didn't just cover the basics, they also got into some really specific situations that require extra care, like driving through flooded areas.
Oh, right. Because those puddles can be deceiving. You might think you're cruising through a shallow puddle, but underneath,
Could be a pothole large enough to swallow a small car. But even more importantly, driving through deep water can actually affect your brakes.
That's right. One of the sources recommended testing your brakes after driving through a flooded area, just to be sure.
Yeah.
Better to be safe than sorry,
Mm.
especially if you need to stop suddenly.
Mm.
Speaking of situations that require, like, extra vigilance, mountain driving popped up in our research.
Yeah?
Talk about a recipe for, like, adventure.
No kidding. Wind gusts, limited visibility, potential avalanche zones. The guide really paints a picture of the challenges. One thing that stood out to me was the emphasis on being aware of snowplows.
That makes sense. Those things are like the behemoths of the road, especially in snowy conditions.
Right.
But it's not something I would have necessarily thought about.
Right. It just highlights how important it is to share the road responsibly no matter what you're driving. And speaking of sharing the road, one source had a whole section dedicated to motorcycles in adverse conditions.
Oh, wow. Now that's a whole other level of vulnerability. I can only imagine how dicey it must be to handle a motorcycle in the rain or snow.
Yeah, the source really emphasized visibility, even more so than for cars. Wearing bright colors and reflective gear was like a major point.
That makes sense. If you're smaller and less visible to begin with, you've really got to compensate for that, especially when visibility is already compromised by the weather. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from basic car prep to handling some pretty intense conditions. What's the, like, overarching theme you're seeing in all this?
I think it boils down to anticipation and adaptation. You're constantly adjusting to the environment, to other drivers, and to your own vehicle's limitations. It's about being present, aware, and ready to react appropriately.
Which, let's be honest, are valuable skills to have even when you're not behind the wheel, right?
Totally. It's like driving safely is a microcosm for, navigating life's unexpected detours. But on that note, before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more thing I want to bring up that we haven't really touched on yet. Technology.
Ah, right. Yeah.
Specifically, like how all those fancy new car features play into this whole driving in adverse conditions equation. Yeah, that's a whole other layer, isn't it? Our cars are practically becoming like computers on wheels these days. Lane assist, automatic braking, real-time weather updates. It's amazing what they can do.
Right. So it makes you wonder, like, how much can we really rely on these systems? Are they just there to assist us, or are we starting to, like, depend on them too much? It's a slippery slope, no pun intended.
Yeah, definitely something to ponder, especially as these technologies become even more advanced. It kind of begs the question, where does the line blur between driver and vehicle, and how will that change the way we approach driving safety in the future?
Talk about food for thought.
Mhm.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything from our deep dive into driving safely in adverse conditions. We went from the basics of
Yeah.
car prep to handling those, like, white knuckle situations.
Yes, absolutely.
And we even, like, dipped our toes into the